Before we begin tonight's story, I want to ask you something gentle, something simple. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it in your part of the world? Tell me down below in the comments, because I love to see the little constellation of places and hours where these stories drift out into the night. Some of you are just settling into bed. Some of you are traveling. Some of you may even be listening in the quiet hours before dawn. Each of you brings a different silence, a different setting, and somehow that makes these old tales feel alive again. So let me know where you are. Let me know what the clock reads, and then let the rest of the world fall away as we step softly into the shadows of history, into the story of a man who once ruled New Orleans from the dark edges of its swamps. Chapter 1. The Butcher of Rampart Street. They called him Carlo Marcello, but in the whispers of New Orleans' French Quarter, he was something more sinister. The Butcher of Rampart Street, a man who stood barely 5'4", but whose reach extended from Bourbon Street to the steps of the White House. Born in Sicily, raised in the humid backstreets of Louisiana, Marcello was not the kind of gangster who thrived on noise and theatrics. He had none of the flamboyant arrogance of John Gotti, none of the magazine cover charisma of Lucky Luciano. Instead, his empire was built on something darker, something invisible, like swamp mist curling between the iron balconies and gas lamps of the quarter. To understand Marcello, you must first understand the city that birthed him. A city of jazz and voodoo, of Catholic rituals and Protestant rage, of Mardi Gras masks that hid sins too foul to speak aloud. In the 1920s and 30s, New Orleans was not just a port, it was the artery of America's underworld, the entry point through which drugs, guns, and immigrants slipped past customs under the protection of politicians too busy collecting envelopes of cash to notice. Marcello thrived here because he understood the contradictions of New Orleans. This was a city that could sing gospel on Sunday morning and gamble away fortunes by Sunday night. It was a city where a judge could weep in church pews and then dine on Marcello's oysters Rockefeller, while promising him protection from prosecution. The young Carlo saw all of this, and like a swamp predator, he learned how to lie still beneath the surface until the right moment to strike. His empire began with slot machines, those shiny mechanical idols that devoured nickels and spat out dreams. By the 1940s, Marcello's men controlled nearly every slot machine in Louisiana. Over 3,000 machines clinking away in bars, diners, and back rooms, generating millions in tribute. To the average citizen, it was just the sound of gambling. To Marcello, it was the pulse of a kingdom. He moved on to narcotics, exploiting New Orleans port as a gateway for heroin pipelines that fed not only the French Quarter but the entire East Coast. But money alone wasn't his genius. Marcello perfected something far scarier: political camouflage. He didn't just bribe officials, he owned them. Police chiefs dined at his table. Senators owed him campaign donations. Judges deferred trials until evidence went missing. By the 1950s, FBI agents estimated that Marcello's political network stretched all the way to Washington, D.C., an octopus of corruption that smothered every attempt at prosecution. Even J. Edgar Hoover, America's great crusader against organized crime, seemed strangely hesitant to pursue him. Some say it was fear. Others say it was evidence too explosive to reveal. And then there are the whispers, dark, chilling whispers, that Marcello's reach extended even into the tragedy of November 22, 1963, when President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. Historians argue, skeptics dismiss, but in smoky bars from Baton Rouge to Metairie, old-timers swear Marcello's hand was in it. His motive, Kennedy's crusade against organized crime, led by his brother Robert, had targeted Marcello personally. Marcello was once kidnapped by federal agents and dumped in the Guatemalan jungle without papers. He clawed his way back to Louisiana, swearing vengeance. Some claim that when Kennedy fell in Dallas, Marcello poured himself a glass of bourbon and toasted quietly in his Metairie estate. A smile thin as a blade. Whether myth or truth, the speculation has never died. And here's what makes it terrifying. Marcello was not a showman, he was a swamp ghost. A man who vanished into the silence of the city, leaving no headlines but endless rumors. To this day, the streets of the French Quarter carry his legend like a curse. Every time you hear jazz floating through the humid air, every time you see a politician shaking hands in Jackson Square, you can't help but wonder, are they truly free men? Or are they still dancing to the tune of a boss who's been dead for decades? That's the horror of Marcello. His empire wasn't just crime. It was a kind of voodoo over the city itself. A curse written not in blood, but in silence. Chapter 2. The Empire of Shadows. By the 1960s, Carlo Marcello was no longer just a gangster. He was an institution. His estate outside New Orleans, a sprawling compound hidden by moss-draped oaks, became a fortress of power where politicians, judges, and businessmen came not as guests, but as supplicants. It is said that Marcello hosted gatherings where state governors sat beside hitmen, where shrimp magnates and oil barons struck deals under the watchful eyes of Marcello's lieutenants. These meetings were not recorded in minutes or transcripts. They were sealed in the silence of favors, debts, and promises, too dangerous to write down. What made Marcello terrifying was not just the reach of his empire, but the permanence of it. While other mob families rose and fell with spectacular violence, Marcello's power was like the Mississippi River itself, slow, constant, unstoppable, shaping the land around it. The data tells the story. By FBI estimates, Marcello controlled not just slot machines, but entire industries. He had a silent tax on shipping, gambling, drugs, and even real estate. In the late 1950s, the Bureau suggested that Marcello's operations generated revenues rivaling $2 billion in today's dollars, money that flowed through fronts so legitimate that even banks treated him as a respectable businessman. Construction companies tied to Marcello built highways and bridges. Shrimping operations tied to his men exported seafood nationwide. And yet behind every dollar was a shadow, a whisper, a veiled threat that made refusal impossible. But money was only part of it. Marcello built his empire on fear without spectacle. Unlike Anastasia in New York, he did not paint sidewalks red. Men who betrayed him simply disappeared into the swamps. It was a uniquely New Orleans method of disposal. The bayous became his graveyard. Police reports from the 1950s and 60s list dozens of missing persons tied loosely to Marcello's operations, bodies never found. Local fishermen spoke of human bones tangled in nets, of alligators with bellies too full, of swamp mists that carried the sound of screams at night. Was it superstition or the price of betrayal? No one dared ask too loudly. Speculation pushes the story into darker territory. Some researchers believe Marcello wove his power into New Orleans culture itself, embedding his influence in Mardi Gras crews, in Catholic charities, even in jazz clubs where his men laundered cash through nightly performances. If true, then his empire was not just criminal, it was cultural. The music you danced to, the parades you watched, the food you ate, might have been stamped invisibly with his approval. He created a parallel city beneath the city, a New Orleans that tourists never saw, a city where every bartender, every longshoreman, every alderman owed him something. And the chilling part? The FBI never fully dismantled it. Even after his arrest in 1981 for racketeering and conspiracy, even after he served prison time, Marcello returned to Louisiana like a monarch reclaiming his throne. Old men kissed his hand. Young hustlers sought his blessing. It was as though time itself had bent to his will. When he finally died in 1993, it was not from bullets or betrayal, but from the slow decay of age. And yet, even now, whispers say his network still breathes, that modern construction projects, political campaigns, and union funds in Louisiana still bear traces of his shadow. And this is where the story becomes speculative, almost supernatural. How does a man rule a city so completely that decades after his death, his name still carries weight? How does fear outlive flesh? Perhaps it is because Marcello did not just build an empire of men. He built an empire of silence, a silence so deep it became part of the city's DNA. And when you walk the French Quarter at night, when you feel the weight of shadows pressing from the balconies, when you hear the sound of jazz played low and mournful, you must ask yourself, is it just the music of the city, or is it the ghost of a man who still owns it? Chapter 3. The President's Curse. To understand the terror of Carlo Marcello's empire, you must step into the darkest chapter of American history, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. For decades, his name has drifted through this tragedy like a ghost, whispered but never spoken aloud in the halls of power. The theory sounds like the stuff of pulp novels, that a short Sicilian gangster from the swamps of Louisiana reached so far into the machinery of government that he severed the head of a president. But history is full of inconvenient shadows, and when you trace the lines of motive, means, and opportunity, Marcello's silhouette emerges with disturbing clarity. In 1961, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, launched a merciless crusade against organized crime, tearing into mobsters with a personal zeal. He made Marcello a target. Not only did Robert indict him on racketeering charges, he personally ordered him kidnapped by federal agents and dumped in Guatemala like refuse. No trial, no warning, no respect. Marcello clawed his way back to Louisiana, stripped of his dignity, swearing revenge on the Kennedy brothers. According to informants, Marcello once snarled to his men, "If you cut off the head, the tail will die. Kill the head. The dog cannot bite." The head, of course, was John F. Kennedy. Now pause and consider. Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin, grew up in New Orleans. He haunted neighborhoods that Marcello controlled, brushed against people tied to Marcello's operations, even attended meetings in offices where mob-connected lawyers worked. Jack Ruby, the man who silenced Oswald before he could speak, had known ties to mob figures in Dallas, who in turn owed fealty to Marcello's syndicate. In 1979, a congressional report concluded that Marcello had the motive, means, and opportunity to orchestrate the assassination. Former FBI agents later admitted that Marcello's name appeared constantly in the shadows of their investigations, but no one ever brought him to trial for it. No headlines screamed his guilt. No judge called his name. Instead, he continued to rule Louisiana quietly, like a man who had pulled off the crime of the century and walked away untouched. And that is where the story tilts from history into horror, because if Marcello truly ordered Kennedy's death, it means a mafia boss from New Orleans wielded more power than the CIA, the Secret Service, and the federal government combined. It means democracy itself bent beneath the will of a man who never stood taller than 5'4". Even if you dismiss the theory, even if you believe Oswald acted alone, the whispers are enough to chill the blood. Why did the FBI seal so many files under national security? Why did so many investigators end their careers, convinced Marcello was involved? Why do the shadows of Dallas always seem to stretch back toward the swamps of Louisiana? The scariest part isn't what we know. It's what we can never prove. Because in Marcello's world, silence was always the final bullet. And silence outlives truth. Chapter 4. The Bayou Graveyard. If Marcello's alleged role in Dallas is the myth that makes him infamous, then the bayous of Louisiana are the reality that makes him terrifying. To understand his rule, you must picture not the glittering lights of Bourbon Street, but the dark stillness of swamp water under a crescent moon. Marcello's empire was not maintained only by bribes and ballots. It was enforced by the silence of the bayou. In the 1950s and 60s, dozens of men vanished after crossing him. Bookkeepers who skimmed from slot machine revenues, dealers who cut into the heroin trade, politicians who threatened to expose his dealings. Their names faded from police files, their families left to mourn without bodies to bury. The whispers all pointed to the swamps. Fishermen spoke of human bones tangled in nets, of alligators so fat they seemed swollen with more than fish, of screams carried on night winds across the cypress groves. Local deputies, bound by politics and fear, looked the other way. The swamp was Marcello's judge and executioner. There are darker stories, the kind no court record ever preserved. In the bars of Lafitte, old-timers tell of the Bayou Choir, a group of traitors Marcello ordered disposed of in a single night, bound and gagged, rosaries shoved down their throats, their bodies sunk beneath the roots of cypress trees. Fishermen swore that on foggy nights you could hear voices there, muffled prayers and half screams, as though the swamp itself carried their agony forever. Myth? Maybe. But the myth had power, and power kept men silent. Few dared betray Marcello, not because of bullets, but because of what came after. The certainty that their bodies would vanish into the bayou, and their names into the void. And even now, long after his death, the swamp refuses to keep all its secrets. Hurricanes tear through Louisiana, ripping up trees, shifting soil, dredging up the past. After Katrina, there were unspoken rumors of skeletons found in the wreckage. Skeletons with bullet holes, rosaries, still wrapped around cracked ribs, officially dismissed as storm debris, unofficially whispered as Marcello's ghosts rising to the surface. And that is the haunting truth of his reign. He did not just kill men, he erased them. He turned Louisiana's swamps into unmarked cemeteries, and the city learned to live with the silence. Even today, when the mist curls through the bayou and the frogs fall silent, some swear they feel him still. The short man with the cold smile, who made the water his accomplice. Chapter 5. The Echo of Silence. Decades have passed since Carlo Marcello's body was lowered into the earth in 1993, and yet his name still lingers in New Orleans, like smoke that never clears. The French Quarter has changed. Tourists now flood Bourbon Street with neon cocktails and flashing cameras. But beneath the laughter and music, the silence he created remains. Old-timers in barber shops and oyster houses still whisper that some businesses pay invisible taxes, money funneled into shell companies, whose origins trace back to Marcello's labyrinth of fronts. Real estate holdings, seafood exporters, construction firms, many of them were tied to him at one point, and some still operate today under different names. Their ledgers, as clean as their history is dirty. Investigators argue that millions of dollars from his empire were never seized, never even identified, laundered so perfectly that they now circulate like ghost money inside legitimate banks and corporations. That means every time someone in Louisiana buys a house, orders shrimp, or steps onto a freshly paved highway, they might unknowingly be walking across Marcello's shadow. The silence is not just financial. It is political, cultural, even spiritual. Louisiana's elections are still whispered to be touched by old networks of influence that Marcello seeded decades ago. Campaign donations flow through obscure committees, lobbying groups emerge and vanish, and in the background, it all feels like echoes of his design. In Mardi Gras crews, in church fundraisers, in charitable organizations, one still finds faint fingerprints of a system that blurred the line between generosity and control. He created a template for invisible governance, power that survives not by noise, but by erasing the noise altogether. And maybe that's why his legend refuses to die. Unlike Gotti or Capone, Marcello never sought fame. He sought permanence. Fame fades. Permanence lingers. And so, his story clings to the city like humidity. Unseen, uncomfortable, undeniable. And then there are the darker whispers still. Some say the swamp holds more secrets that will surface as time passes. Hurricanes tear through Louisiana every decade, uprooting trees, shifting soil, dredging up what was meant to stay buried. After Katrina, there were stories unreported in the news of bones found in the wreckage, skeletons with bullet holes, rosaries still wrapped around ribs. Were they storm victims, or Marcello's missing men rising once more? No one will ever know, because in New Orleans, silence is easier than truth. Silence keeps the city alive, and maybe that is Marcello's final curse. He taught a city to survive by swallowing its own voice, by learning to live with shadows and pretending they aren't there. His empire is gone, his body is gone, but his silence remains, and silence is stronger than bullets, stronger than prisons, stronger sometimes even than death. So as you close your eyes tonight, let the story of Carlo Marcello drift into the dark, like the low hum of a jazz trumpet, echoing down an empty street. Think of the city he ruled, A place of music and masks, parades and prayers, laughter built on bones. And know that some powers do not die when a man dies. They slip into the air, into the water, into the silence between things. And in New Orleans, silence has always spoken louder than truth. If you ever walk through the quarter after midnight, and you feel the weight of eyes on you, or hear a faint sound beneath the music, ask yourself, are you hearing the city, or are you hearing the echo of a man whose empire was built on shadows? Sleep now, and let the silence carry you, as it carried him. For in the end, the scariest stories are not the ones that end in blood, but the ones that never really end at all.